Hey, what's happening, Every Nation Bryanston? Welcome to our YouTube channel. Hope you are doing well. And before we continue with anything today, I want to first just acknowledge and thank anyone who's watching this. Maybe it's your first or second time tuning in to this channel. Welcome. We are all about two things: knowing God and making Him known. It is our privilege, it is our pleasure, and it is our mission. I trust over the next hour or so, you will be encouraged towards this direction. But do us a favor, if that is you, first or second time here at Every Nation Bryanston, or maybe you have never filled out our connection card, please do so right now. Under this video, click on our Linktree link and go to our connection card, fill it out, take you a few seconds. Right at the bottom, choose one out of the 3 charities that are there, and we will donate a 100 Rand gift to a charity of your choice that's doing great work in the city of Johannesburg, just because you tuned in today. Welcome, and really glad that you are with us. Hey, I want to let you know that we are going to be starting our Book of Acts series as of next week. In fact, next week we're going to have an intro to the Book of Acts, but our guest is actually going to be coming from America. So next week, our guest preacher will not be here online, but we'll make sure to provide a video that will help you towards Acts next week here, that we will plug in for you so that you can get started in our Acts series. This series is going to go on for a while, and it's going to encourage all of us towards making disciples, reaching out to our friends and families and our community members, and trusting God by His Spirit to help us to make disciples that make disciples. So be praying for that series, and please do join us for that series. And I want to encourage you specifically to join us by being in a group. Some of you may be already in a group. This might be a good opportunity for you to start a group. Just this past week alone, we have close to 60 people who have signed up to join groups, and we are trusting for new Connect group leaders who can help us to lead, to serve, to empower and encourage more people as they be a part of our community through our small group. So sign up either to join a group or to start a group on the links provided below. Now, continuing our miracle series and closing it off today is my boy, is my friend, great legend, and a good mate of mine, Joel Bryce, who's been with us from the beginning. Looking forward to this word, and I think it will be encouraging to you. Time to get your Bibles out, your notepads out, and let's get to work.
So over December holiday, my brother came into town from Canada, and when he is here with me, we like to live a bit of an adventure. So we rented 4-wheelers with his 18-year-old son. I got a bit aggressive on the 4-wheeler and came around a bend and found myself in a thorn bush. Apart from a few scratches and scrapes, I was fine. But I had one little splinter, and I didn't know that splinter was there until later in the day when I met somebody for the first time and shook his hand, and he kind of aggravated the splinter. Kind of hurt, a little bit of pain. Because here's the thing about a splinter. You don't really want to address it because you know there's more pain that comes before the healing. Like pulling out the splinter actually hurts. There's more pain that comes before the healing. So today, we're wrapping up this series on miracles, and I want to start with the splinter. I think we all carry this splinter to some degree or another that sounds a little like this. God of the Old Testament, or God of the New Testament, but God of some previous generation in the lives of Bible characters, is more powerful than the God that I experience in my life today. It's expressed in my daughter Victoria's heavy sigh when she's facing yet another debilitating migraine that she can't really even function until she's on a drug addict level dose of painkillers. When I say to her, "Babe, can I pray for you?" And she replies, "Why, Dad?" Prayer does nothing. It's the honesty of a 7-year-old. You see, God seems to be more powerful at times with Noah and his ark, or Moses and his parting Red Sea, or David and his giant than Victoria and her migraines, or you and your unemployment, or depression, or abusive marriage, or singleness. Fill in the blank. So if a series on miracles doesn't rub against this little splinter for you, amazing. But my gut says that for a good chunk of us, it does. This little splinter of, does Jesus still heal like he did before? And if so, why didn't he heal me? Or why didn't he heal my friend or my mom or my grandma from chronic disease, from cancer, from COVID, from fill in the blank? See, there's pain in coming to a God who seems at times more often silent, who seems at times to heal less today than he did previously. And just like that little splinter, it's pain that you may not want to address. It's better left just untouched. You see, when Siv asked me to preach on miracles, my knee-jerk reaction initially was no. He sent me a WhatsApp, and all he saw were 2 little blue ticks, read, but not responded. Why? Because can I confess this to you? That there are days when I wonder whether miracles do exist like they used to. Whether Jesus does heal like we ask him to. There are days in church services when I feel a little bit uncomfortable when there's a call for healing because I fear the individual disappointment that might come. Can I be that honest with you guys today? But here's the thing. It's impossible to look at the life of Jesus and ignore the miracles. You can certainly try. Thomas Jefferson did. He was one of the American founding fathers. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So he struggled with the miracles of Jesus, and he took a razor and literally cut from his Bible each line that had a story of the incredulous or the unexplainable or the miraculous. See, he wanted Jesus, but he wanted a Jesus who he could reconcile with his own experience. He wanted a Jesus who he could kind of square up with what he saw in the world. So I've been asking myself the last couple of weeks, what Jesus do I want to follow? Like, what Jesus do you want to follow? Because again, it's impossible to look at the life of Jesus and ignore the miracles. Now, before we get into like the series conclusion text, which is out of John 9, I want to set the context a little bit around how we read miracles. So we're closing up this series, and I just want to articulate how often most people who read the Bible and read these stories of miracles respond, okay? So I think there's 4 ways. The first way that most people will read the miracles is they first accept them as literal. They kind of accept them as a factual depiction of what actually occurred. No metaphors, no imagery, no questions asked, history. That's the first way. The second is perhaps they read them as strictly metaphorical, right? So like the story of Jesus touching a leper is a metaphor for God touching us despite our unworthiness. But maybe Jesus didn't actually cure or heal the leper, so it's kind of metaphorical. A third way that people often read miracles is they rationalize them. They try to find a scientific explanation for them. Maybe the demon-possessed man actually just had epilepsy. Or when Jesus walked on the water, maybe he was walking on a sandbar. They try to find some scientific explanation for the miracle, leaving a fourth way, which is to outright reject them, like Thomas Jefferson. And maybe because of miracles' existence in the Bible, these people render the whole thing kind of intellectually implausible, and a text may be reserved for the uneducated. So today, I want to propose a fifth way, which is this. It's to recognize, it's a bit of a combination of 1 and 2. It's to recognize that Jesus is absolutely concerned about our physical bodies and their wholeness. That is a literal reading. But also seem to at times use miracles strategically to teach us something about God, about his own divinity, about his own message, and why he came to the world. That is their metaphorical meaning. St. Augustine, he's in the 4th century, he said this: "The miracle which we admire on the outside also has something inside which must be understood. If we see a piece of beautiful handwriting, we are not satisfied simply to note that the letters are evenly formed, equally and elegantly. We also want to know the meaning the letters convey. In the same way, a miracle is not a picture, something merely to look at and admire and to be left at that. It is much more like a piece of writing which we must learn to read and understand." So a couple of quick examples of what I mean that come straight out of the texts that we've studied in this series. The first is the story of Jesus feeding the crowds. All right, this story, Jesus feeding the 5,000 and feeding the 4,000. It's documented both in Matthew and Mark. In the story of the 5,000, there are 12 baskets left over, as Siv mentioned. And to a 1st century Jew, those 12 baskets full of bread would have easily signified in their mind's eye bread provided to their ancestors in the wilderness, to the 12 tribes of Israel, manna provided from heaven. It's like Jesus is fulfilling that prophecy, saying, I am the bread of life for all 12 tribes of Israel. But then immediately after that story is Jesus feeding the 4,000. And in that story, there's 7 baskets left over. Now, in 1st century Judaism, and it's still kind of largely true today, numbers have a lot of significance, all right? So the 7 had Gentile connotations. And to a Jew, he also would have thought of creation. Think of the 7 days of creation. And so 7 would have also signified completeness. So the 7 baskets for the 4,000 that were left over would have signified that the bread of life that Jesus is has come for the non-Jews as well. And in that way, Jesus' work is complete for all of humanity. So there is a story here of Jesus healing people who are hungry. But it's like a much deeper meaning around Jesus being the bread of life, life for all of humanity, the Jews, those who are in, and the non-Jews, those who are out. Or the story of Jesus walking on the water that Siv talked about last week. To a 1st century Jew, waters represented chaos, kind of disorder, the world kind of that needs to be reoriented. That's what waters would have represented. A 1st century Jew would have thought of the chaotic waters of creation or the chaotic waters of Noah. And so Jesus walking on the waters and rebuking the waters would have been like Jesus rebuking chaos, Jesus rising above chaos. Like when he said, I have overcome the world. Do not be afraid, for I have overcome the world. It's Jesus kind of rising above chaos. Or the story of the bleeding woman. We didn't talk about this story in this series, but she spent all of her resources on doctors who have not healed her, and she's cast from the temple and considered eternally unclean. And that marker of being unclean was a clear social and religious line defining who's in and who's out. And the uneducated belief at this time would have been that menstrual bleeding was contagious. And so for her to touch somebody, like a rabbi, Jesus, would have been a strictly punishable offense. So in this context, Jeffrey John, he's an academic and a priest, writes this: if we stay at the level of the story, the level of what happened to the individual woman, we miss the extraordinary world-changing meaning of what Jesus did. Certainly, we see a moving example of Jesus' compassion in releasing a poor woman who had suffered exceptionally for many years. And that is marvelous enough. But this miracle is but something of infinitely greater significance than the story of only one woman. We are shown Jesus overturning the menstrual taboo which subjugated and oppressed women, a taboo that still contributes today to the oppression of women in many parts of the world and indeed in some parts of the church. So you have to look at the meaning behind the miracle. So here's what I've found to be a more productive question. Rachel Held Evans said, rather than asking yourself whether or not I believe a miracle to be true, ask, am I living like I do? Am I loving all categories of people, those who are in and those who are out? Am I rising above the chaos of the world and like rebuking the chaos that I see? Am I like accepting societal norms? Or am I like rejecting systems of oppression against women? See, the danger in reading these miraculous stories of Jesus as solely individual stories, without like getting into this context and history, it can result in us seeing Jesus as more active then than he is now. Like if we filter it through, he was just doing individual healings then, and now I have experienced like a lack of healing in my life, then we can think that Jesus is more powerful then than he is now. But that was him establishing his ministry, and each of the miracles had tremendous significance and importance for communicating something about his ministry and what he came to do. I hope that's clear. So with that context in mind, we're going to read one of these stories, which is John 9. John 9, verses 1 to 7. As he walked along, Jesus saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which is translated sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. Okay, so 3 observations that I took from this text. Certainly many more, but 3 that most notably stuck out to me. The first is a return to the garden. The second is the question that precedes every miracle. And the third is an individual seen by God. All right, the return, the question, and the individual. Let me pray. God, I pray that we come to you with a splinter this morning, a splinter of a little bit of pain around this question of healing, of asking for a miracle, believing for a miracle, and it not always coming. So would you kind of be present with us now? Give us wisdom and clarity as we study this. Amen. So the return, the question, and the individual. The return to the garden. So let's start with blindness. This is the most common healing that Jesus performed throughout all of his ministry. There's documentation of his healing other physical ailments, but nothing as common as blindness. Matthew 9, Matthew 12, Matthew 15, Matthew 21, Mark 8, Mark 10, Luke 7, John 9. We have around like 10 to 12 stories of Jesus healing blindness. Why? Why is this such a common healing? As I've studied for this, what became clear is that it was not a more common illness. In fact, one of the most common illnesses that Jesus would have encountered would have been leprosy, in light of how contagious leprosy was, not blindness. But yet we have way more stories of Jesus healing blindness than any other illness. So why is that? On the one hand, the promise of sight for the blind was an intricate component of the prophecies in Isaiah about a coming Messiah. So here are just a couple of examples. Isaiah 29 says, "On that day, the deaf shall hear the words of a scroll, and out of their gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind shall see." Or Isaiah 35, "Here is your God. He will come with vengeance. He will come and save you. And the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped." Okay, but given the number of stories of Jesus healing blind people, we can assume that there's something more at work than solely his representation as Messiah. Otherwise, there would have been just as many stories of deaf people no longer being deaf, because in all of those prophecies in Isaiah, the deaf shall hear and the blind shall see were like paired together. But we only have one story of deaf people in all of the Gospels of somebody being deaf made to hear, but multiple stories of blindness being cured. So clearly Jesus is getting at something that's really important about the ability to see. To get a hint at the meaning, I think we need to turn to the end of the story. So the context of the end of the story is, we just read, the man goes to the pool of Siloam and comes back and he's made to see. But then some of the Pharisees are struggling with this healing, and they don't believe that the man was actually born blind. So if you read the whole story, they call the parents in, and the parents have to say yes, this is the man, and he was born blind. And eventually the Pharisees are like, on what authority did Jesus do this for you? And the man's kind of confused, I don't know. He must be a prophet, he healed me. So there's all this kind of debate and argument, and what ends up happening is they cast this man from the temple. And it's here that Jesus speaks to the man. So this is now John 9. He's speaking to the man and to the people around him, all right? After he had been cast out from the temple. I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind. Now some of the Pharisees near him heard him say this and said to him, surely we are not blind, are we? Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say we see, your sin remains. So here's the key. Jesus is equating the ability to see with the ability to recognize one's sin. And he's equating blindness with the inability to recognize one's sin. And this recognition is incredibly important to Jesus in light of how many times he heals blind people. So it's the difference between physically seeing and knowing something to be true. Helen Keller was an author, American author, who was born blind, and she said this: the only thing worse than being blind is being able to see but having no vision. It's a bit like the man dying of lung cancer, and on his deathbed, realizing that because he had smoked a pack of cigarettes every day for his entire life, now he's dying of lung cancer. And the doctor's saying, well, it's because of your behavior with the cigarettes. He kind of says, now I see. It's the difference between seeing and knowing. So Jesus is saying that he's equating the ability to see with the ability to recognize one's sin. So I want to unpack that a bit. What does he actually mean by what he said to the Pharisee directly, which was, but now you say we see, and your sin remains. So the Greek word for sin here is hamartia. It's still used in Greece in archery circles. It's directly translated, meaning to miss the mark, okay? But here, we got to kind of note the grammar. Jesus says to the Pharisees, just because you say we see, your sin remains. And he's saying the noun form of that word, which is hamartano, okay? Versus other times when, Jesus says, go and sin no more, it's the verb form. It's go and miss the mark no more. So it's the verb form versus the noun form. A noun form meaning an inner state of missing the mark. So Jesus is saying that the ability to see is the ability to recognize one's very state of missing the mark, something is off inside of me. It's the difference between me recognizing my own acts of missing the mark, when I behave in a way that misses the mark, which it's kind of quite clear to me when I miss the mark. But it's much harder to recognize a very state of being that is missing the mark. So this is what I want to unpack a little bit. What is it that Jesus wants us to recognize in us missing the mark? So to get an answer, we have to go back to the garden. So in Genesis 3, we get a clue of what Jesus means when he's talking about missing the mark. This is Eve speaking to the serpent in Genesis 3, verse 4. We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not die, for God knows that when you eat the fruit, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God. Now, I don't want to get caught up in was this a literal serpent talking to a woman? Was this a fruit tree in the middle of the garden? But I do want to get caught up in this fundamental lie, this fundamental evil that all of humanity, that each of us must address, which is this: I do not need God. I am an independent, fully competent, self-sufficient being. I can create like God. I can comfort like God. I can define my own way. I can be like God. You see, prior to this lie, that their eyes would be opened and they would be like God, Adam and Eve walked in complete dependence upon God. And their eyes were open. But the lie was, you can be for yourself what God was meant to be for you. Therefore, you do not need him. And this is what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees that they could not see. You see, they thought they had all the right knowledge, all the right beliefs, all the right religion, and they had become God-like figures in their own minds. They had bitten from the same apple and believed that their eyes were open and that they could be like God, and therefore did not need him. So what Jesus is looking for is this admission, the ability to see that I am not in control of my life, that I cannot be like God, that I need God. It's the realization that even my best motivations, the best motives of my heart are motivated from a place of selfish ambition. It's realizing that I'm often motivated by lust or by greed or by a desire to get ahead or to be perceived a certain way, that the very state of my soul is missing the mark. Not that I'm a bad person in the state of my soul, but that the very state of my soul is independent, not dependent on God. Tim Keller says that until Holy Spirit opens your eyes, you are blind to the reality of your sin and the reality of your grace. That you miss the mark more than you could possibly know, but you're more loved than you could possibly imagine. And this is what the Pharisees couldn't see, that their eyes were opened, the lie, and they could be like God. Okay, so back to the man born blind. Just like the blindness that Jesus alludes to started in the garden, the healing also refers back to the garden. He takes spit and he takes dirt. You see, spit, because few things signify utter union and dependence than sharing of saliva. It's God breathing into the man's nostrils the breath of life. It's the intimacy of sharing breath, mouth to mouth, and in that way bringing life. And then secondly, the dirt. To a first century Jew, again, hearing of the soil of the earth, their minds would have immediately been taken back to the garden, to God forming Adam from the dust of the ground. Or to King Solomon's cry in Ecclesiastes, from dust we've come, and to dust we shall return. Jesus is taking the man born blind back to the garden, back to the moment of dependence, back to before the serpent said, your eyes will be opened and you could be like God. Just as the sickness started in the garden, the healing happens in the garden, spit and dirt. And in that moment, it's the garden moment of complete and utter surrender. I recently read Bono, the lead singer of U2's book. It's called Surrender, I think. He says this: the moment of surrender is the moment you choose to lose control of your life. It's the split second of powerlessness, where you must trust that some kind of higher power must be in charge because you certainly aren't. You see, in this way, the miracle is so much more about the restoration of the way God intends the world to be. We often think of miracles as suspending natural order. But in this way, God is restoring and redeeming natural order, the way he intended it to be, that we would be dependent upon God, that we would see that we're not in control. And in this way, take us back to the garden, to the moment of surrender, to the moment of dependence, taking a knee, acknowledging our need, walking with a limp. So the meaning behind this miracle is Jesus bringing us back to that point of full sight. Okay. Secondly, the question that precedes every miracle. I don't think we can conclude a series on miracles without addressing this. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? At the heart of all pain and suffering is a simple question: why? Why me? Why has God allowed this to happen? Why? Here the disciples assumed that they knew the answer. Because someone sinned. You see, it's like the disciples are getting a bit confident at this point in the story. They've been with Jesus. So this story occurs in John 9. It's about 2 years and 9 months into Jesus' ministry. So his ministry is almost done. The disciples have been with Jesus a long while at this point. And you can almost hear them getting a bit cocky. Well, obviously, somebody sinned, somebody did wrong, Jesus? But we just haven't quite figured out who. Was it the man or was it the parents? Which is a bit odd. How would the man have sinned? It's just kind of an odd question. Maybe they believe in karma or the afterlife or a reincarnation or something. But their assumption is this. If you're having a hard time in life, you must have done something to deserve it. Or if you're having an abundant life, you must have done something to deserve it. You reap what you sow, right? How many of us can relate to that assumption? When things are going poorly, we think, what have I done to deserve this? Or when things are going well, we think I'm blessed. And this is the fundamental belief that we absolutely have to address on a series on miracles. Because a discussion on miracles without a discussion on pain is incomplete. We wouldn't need the miracle if we didn't have pain. So let's just speak about pain for a second. Is the pain and suffering that you experience at an individual level caused by your individual behavior? This is the question that the disciples are really asking. And I'm not talking about cause and effect. Obviously, if I drink too much, I'm probably going to get hungover. Or if I sleep with anyone with a pulse, I probably will end up with an STD. Or as I said, if you smoke a pack of cigarettes for the rest of your life every day, you'll probably die of lung cancer. It's very simple, cause and effect. But this is not what Jesus is talking about. Remember the context. It's very specific. It says the man was born blind, something that he most clearly had no contribution towards. See, this is a story of unexplained illness, of cancer, of miscarriage, of a car accident, of Victoria's migraines. It's most certainly not about something that links cause and effect. And it's in this context of unexplained illness in which Jesus is answering this question. What caused it? So what does Jesus say? First, he rejects the idea that the sufferer is to blame. And then second, he turns the focus away from the pain. So first, his view is clearly no. The sufferer did not cause his or her pain. And I know this because he simply says so. He says neither he nor his parents are to blame. Jesus makes this same point in Luke 13. In Luke 13, there's the story of some Galileans who were murdered by the Romans. And in that context, Jesus questions his listeners and says this, do you suppose that these Galileans were worse sinners because they suffered such things? Surely I tell you, no. Like in Luke 13, Jesus is making this very simple point. This illness is not caused by them missing the mark. We kind of know this to be true. Our experience would suggest that what we observe in life, this is actually true. We all know plenty of terrible people who seem to get lots of good breaks. Or really selfless, caring people who seem to just draw the short straw every time, facing sickness or poverty or bad luck. Jesus said in Matthew 5 that God causes the sun to rise on the evil-natured and on the good-natured, the rain to fall on the just and on the unjust. So clearly Jesus rejects the idea that the sufferer is to blame. But secondly, he redirects the attention away from the pain. So while the disciples, they're preoccupied with the pain and what caused it, Jesus directs their attention to the purposes of God. Pain has a way of drawing attention to itself, like that little splinter. You see, we're focused often on the why of our pain. Ultimately, in those situations, we're looking at the pain itself. But Jesus is asking us to look through the pain at what God might be doing. He doesn't actually answer the question of why the pain exists, but instead simply says God has work to do. He doesn't give the reason. And this part was probably most difficult for me as I prepared. I wanted him to give the reason for unexplained pain. But we may never know the reason. It could just be random happenstance, that there is still chaos in the world, that the world is incomplete, and the work of all things being made new is not yet finished. But Jesus does say, God has work to do. He will work it unto good. He will use it that the works of God might be revealed. So perhaps a better question when we're facing unexplained pain and sadness is to ask, rather than why is this happening to me, but what might God do in my life in the midst of pain? How might God make this work together for my good? But if you're battling sickness and pain, this might seem a tad bit cruel. Like, okay, I'm not to blame for my pain. Sounds good. I didn't think I was. Okay, good. And God might use it for my good. All right, also good. But I'm still suffering. But I still face it. And it's here I want to turn to the individual seen by God. Because a theology without lament and sorrow and sitting with the pain is kind of cruel at worst and insufficient at best. So let's conclude by turning to the individual seen by God. So this story starts with this very simple statement. As he walked along, Jesus saw a man. The gift of God is to see you before it is to restore you. Look at the order of the story. He walks along and he sees a man before he heals him, before he calls him out to do great things, before he sends him out, he turns and he sees him. Earlier in this message, I said these words. I said the point of the miracle stories in the Bible seem to be much more than stories of some individuals receiving individual healings. And while I think this is so important, we cannot ignore the fact that in each of these stories is an individual receiving relief from his or her suffering. An individual seen by God is at the heart of each of these stories. And you know what I've probably found most fascinating about this text? The fact that the man never asks to be healed. In all the other stories of Jesus curing blindness, the story is preceded by someone shouting out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." They ask for the healing, but not here. He doesn't ask. He doesn't cry out. Why? I think that the other stories don't mention that they were actually like, it doesn't say they were born blind. It actually could have been just like an eye disease that they formed over time and like became blind. But not here. Here we're told he was born blind. And we're told that like he's a man, that he was probably waiting for healing for a long time. And we can assume that he knew that Jesus cures blindness. Remember what I said, this is like 2 years and 9 months into the ministry of Jesus. And multiple times in the Gospels it says, and the news of Jesus spread. And again, there's multiple healings of blindness. So this man, A, was blind from birth, B, probably knew that the guy passing him cures blindness, and C, did not ask. Perhaps he thought it was too much for God. Perhaps he thought what God previously did in the lives of my Hebrew ancestors is more powerful than what God will currently do in my life today. I've prayed and I've asked, and I'm simply tired of waiting for my miracle. You know, in my experience, waiting grounds down even like the strongest rock of inspiration. So in his waiting, he no longer asks. And Jesus sees him. And Jesus doesn't wait for him to ask. And Jesus doesn't even ask for his consent. Most of the time, Jesus works via consent. He's asked to be healed, and he says things like, well, what do you want me to do for you? Or do you want me to be made, do you want to be made well? But not here. Here, Jesus does something entirely different. He spits in the ground and he makes a clay. He takes the man back to the garden, back to the moment of complete and utter dependence. Thousands of years prior is the story of Abraham and Sarah, where they were waiting also on their own promise for a child. And as the story goes, they're tired of waiting and they take matters into their own hands. And Sarah tells Abraham to force himself upon their African slave, Hagar, who they picked up in Egypt years prior. We have no indication that this was a consensual act. In fact, we can probably safely assume that it was not because she was their servant. And then she falls pregnant. And they respond by casting her into the desert, into the heat of the day, abandoned and left to die. And in this context, God sees her. It says in Genesis 16, God found Hagar by a spring in the wilderness. And then God begins to speak promises over her life, promises of the child growing in her own womb and the inheritance that awaits her. And do you know how she responds? She gives God a nickname. She's the first recorded person in the entirety of the human history to call God by a nickname. She calls him El Roi, which is directly translated, the God who sees me. Carolyn Custis James said, before Hagar's encounter with the angel of the Lord, God is spoken of in large, majestic, sweeping terms like Elohim, the creator God, the judge of all the earth, Yahweh, the covenant maker, the promise keeper, El Shaddai, the Almighty, but not in the intimately personal terms that Hagar used. Imagine the boldness required to give God a nickname, the God who sees me. You see, God may have a purpose or meaning behind giving a miracle or withholding a miracle, but God consistently and always pays attention to the individual. And here's where I'd like to close. Perhaps you have been following this series and you've come into this week with like a hope or expectation, even faith for a miracle, and it didn't come. Or maybe you're just tired of waiting, tired of hearing of the miracles of old, of kind of name it and claim it vibes. And you need a God simply who steps into your life and sees you even when you're too weak to ask for help. If that's you, why don't you just join me as I pray for you? Yeah, God, while I can't always understand, I can always trust. I can trust the God who has seen me at my very worst and yet will still walk beside me. I can trust the God who may not alleviate the suffering and the tragedy that I observe in my life and in the life of mankind, but that you choose to suffer yourself. Help me to trust you. Help me to know today that I'm seen. That even with my questions, whether I have clarity or whether they're unanswered, that you see me. Even when I'm too weak to ask for help, to pray for assistance, to cry out, would you heal me? You turn and see me. In Jesus' name, amen.
Hey family, I hope that word spoke to you, hope that word encouraged you. Before we head out to the blessing, I want to remind you of two things. One, join a group today, and maybe some of you need to start a group. Looking forward as we launch into our ACT series next week for us journeying together in this. Secondly, if you are interested in taking your next steps in the faith, in growing more deliberately in knowing God and making Him known, we have our Pathways class starting up again this year. This class will help you do exactly that, give you basics and foundations in those two areas, and I think it will be of benefit for you. It happens every Sunday, 2 o'clock online, and so it will be easy for you to access with other leaders who are going to be helping you along the process over a Zoom call. Sign up today for Pathways, and looking forward to seeing you there. Now, as we do every week, I want to leave you with a blessing. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord cause His face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up His countenance upon you, and may He give you peace. fill you with the Spirit, give you courage. See you next week.
There's a place that we can go for quiet comfort, where Jesus found the night he was betrayed, where Adam learned to listen for the Father, where my heart is filled with peace and problems fade, when tragedy wreaks havoc in the moment. There's a path that leads to waters that will heal, where rivers overflow with restoration, the presence of an always loving God. My soul thirsts for you. Only you know my desperate need. So I run to your presence, bringing every imperfection, alone in this moment with God, alone in the garden with God. There's a place that we can go in times of weak, where David turns, where a hurting mother's tears, where you show me I don't run this race alone. Sing my soul thirsts for you. Only you know my desperate need. So I run to your presence, bringing every imperfection, alone in this moment with God, alone in the garden with God. We rest in your presence. Sing our song to you. With every voice and heart we sing. The Lord heard my cry. He heard my song. He's by my side forever. The Lord heard my cry. He heard my song. He's by my side. Sing the Lord. The Lord heard my cry. He heard my song. He's by my side forever. The Lord heard my cry. He heard my song. He's by my side forever. My soul thirsts for you. Only you know my desperate need. So I run to your presence, bringing every imperfection, alone in this moment with God, alone in the garden with God. But one day I will listen to my Father, just beyond the gates of this existence. Welcome home, my child, your walk is over.